Hello guys! Today I'll be talking about Lemony Snicket and how you adapt a narrator to film. And for this I will only be talking about the 2004 movie Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. There is a Netflix show, a pretty good one at that, but a longer runtime and bigger budget means the issues with the narrator are not as pronounced as they are in a film. So I'll limit myself to just the film, and maybe the show is a subject for another day. Right, here we go. Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events was first written in 1999 and follows the, unfortunate events of siblings Violet, Klaus and Sunny. The series has gained a cult following, me included, for its darkly humorous tone and its expanding narrative. It's a story built on mystery and secrets, and oddly enough for a children's series, not all secrets get answered by the end. The author himself, Daniel Handler, has stated that about once a year he gets a letter from a fan who has figured out what exactly was in the sugar bowl. Perhaps the biggest gimmick of the series is its narrator, Lemony Snicket. A very unhappy man, he follows the events of the children and is deeply dedicated to telling their story. As the series goes on, we find out more and more about him and how he is connected to the siblings. Snicket's dour and deadpan delivery is a lot of the fun of the books. So anyone looking to adapt A Series of Unfortunate Events therefore has a difficult decision to make. How do we deal with Snicket? See, a narrator doesn't really work in movies as well as they do in books. In a movie, we can see what's going on, and a narrator can become cloying and irritating. We simply don't need someone to tell us what we can plainly see. And if you need a narrator to tell us what the characters are feeling, perhaps you need to work on your visual language. A lot of movies tend to do away with narrators for this reason. In Bronte's Jane Eyre, for example, Jane is the first-person narrator and lets the reader in on her emotional world. But movie adaptations tend to do away with this. This is not really an option with Lemony Snicket, because he carries the books. Hell, the 2004 movie even marketed itself as Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. The term unreliable narrator first appeared in Wayne C. Booth's essay The Rhetoric of Fiction from 1961. However, this kind of narrator has existed in literature since pretty much the beginning of written language. We find traces of it in Aristophanes' The Frogs from around 400 BC, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and several tales from Arabian Nights. Unreliable narrators became popular in stories written by postmodern authors, often combined with framing devices, as this allows for a sort of parallel narrative, where we can explore the narrator themselves as a character. So what exactly is an unreliable narrator? Perhaps the best definition is a narrator who has personality and an agenda. The reader cannot trust the narrator to tell the truth about the events. An unreliable narrator doesn't even have to lie. For example, Lolita's narrator Humbert is always honest about what he does to Lolita and what he's thinking, but his way of narrating keeps the reader in the dark. Now, Lemony Snicket is not necessarily keeping information from the readers out of malice, but the mere fact that he is a character as much as a narrator means he cannot give an objective view of the proceedings. He has opinions after all, and he has clearly picked a side. Yet there are in the later books people who consider him a villain and want him dead. He is human, and this makes him unreliable. So how do movies deal with this kind of narrator? Like said before, most adaptations tend to remove the narrator altogether. But some keep the narrator if it is necessary for a twist or insight. Fight Club from 1999 is a good example. While the narrator, as he is actually called, isn't a traditional narrator, we still see the events from his perspective, and it later turns out to be false. Unreliable narrators in particular are difficult to translate to film, without coming across as talking down to the audience. This is probably why both adaptations of Lolita pretty much do away with Humbert's narration, despite the fact that his narration is part of what makes the book so unpleasant. Snicket is, like Humbert, a narrator whose personality creates an element specific to the book where he features. The books are full of his opinions, definitions and rants. This is maybe the most obvious in the beginning of each book, where he advises the reader to go read something else. Furthermore, it's not too much of a stretch to consider Snicket to be Daniel Handler's implicit narrator. The Rhetoric of Fiction coined the term unreliable narrator, but also the implicit author. The implicit author, or the author's other self, is the one who chooses, consciously or not, what gets written. It is pretty metaphorical, but it is basically an idealized image the author creates of themselves, and how we, the readers, think of them. According to Booth's theory, all text has meaning even if the author did not intend for it to be there. An author can express solidarity with LGBT people, but if the only LGBTs in the actual text are portrayed negatively, then the implicit narrator is not actually an ally. Rather, the reader will assume the implicit author has homophobic tendencies. Handler chose to publish his books under the name Lemony Snicket, and this is the persona he prefers to be known as. Snicket is a very conscious, deliberate interpretation of Booth's implicit narrator. The reader can only attribute what is written in a text to Snicket, and Snicket only exists as an author. He has no personality or presence outside of his work. This meta-perspective is absent in the 2004 movie, since Lemony Snicket is not credited with directing it. In the movie, Snicket asks the viewer to go see another movie only once, since the 3 first books of the series here are shoved together into a single narrative. This one instance does, however, show how the filmmakers chose to use their filmatic language. One important thing to consider as you're adapting is translating the language. Literary language and filmatic language are very different things. I won't harp too much on this because other people have already done so much better than I could. But in a nutshell, filmatic language refers to the methods by which you convey information to the viewer. It is not a spoken language, it is visual. The filmatic language depends heavily on cultural norms and when the film is produced. What is expected from visual language here in Sweden might not at all convey the same thing in Japan. To keep this simple, I'll stick to talking about Western filmatic language. The movie opens with a generic children's movie about a little elf, merrily skipping through a forest. Lemony interrupts this and informs us that this is not the movie we'll be watching. This is a fairly effective way of translating something that in the books takes several pages to get across. The Snicket of the books is constantly asking the reader to pick another book. In the movie, however, he shows a clip that we're supposed to assume is the actual story's polar opposite, with the implication that the elf movie is the better choice. At the same time, this characterizes Snicket in a way that deviates from the books. In the narrative itself, Snicket acts as a director, which is the closest equivalent we can get to him being the author within this medium. He is the one who interrupts the movie about the elf, and thus we can assume he was the one who started it to begin with. So either it started as an accident or as a conscious choice. This makes Snicket more unreliable than his book counterpart, since he now deliberately tricks the viewer into watching the wrong story. He does something similar later in the movie, when their children are seemingly safe with a new guardian.
And so, the Baudelaire children went to Peru and together had wonderful adventures with their loving and wonderful new guardian. The end. These are the words I desperately wish I could type.
This kind of teasing isn't really present in the books. It's up for interpretation there whether Snicket's rants are meant to be funny or if they are, at least from his own perspective, completely serious. Either way, most people can agree that while Snicket is not a humorous man, he is a funny character. He is not in on the joke. So why does the movie change Snicket's personality, even if it is subtle? This kind of comedy he provides is not very suited for film, at least not a film where you can't assume the audience is familiar with the way the books are written. Instead, the movie allows Snicket to interact with the medium itself and break the fourth wall. This kind of comedy works better for film, and is today a pretty common thing in both indie movies and bigger Hollywood productions. If Snicket had said the end in the middle of a book, the reader would figure out immediately that if the story actually was over, there wouldn't be so many pages left. In a movie, however, you generally don't see how much time is left. Even the elf joke at the beginning wouldn't really work in the books. The scene plays for about a minute before Snicket interrupts. For how long could you drag the joke in a book? It is pretty reasonable to assume a viewer might watch for a minute or so before realizing it is the wrong film, but a reader is more likely to put away a book after just a few pages if they don't engage with the story. Even the interruption wouldn't really work in a book. It's abrupt and unexpected, but a book does not have the luxury of sound design, so you really couldn't get the same effect. The movie makes the choice to show Snicket rather than just letting us hear him speak. This means that visually he is part of the story. He interacts with the locations where the story takes place in a way that implies he is doing research. This is yet another translation of Snicket to film language. He finished every book with a letter to his editor telling him where he can find the next manuscript, and it's always at the main location of the next book. In the movie, we get to see him leave the stack of papers he's been writing without any comment. This is as show, don't tell as it gets. The end of every book in the series features a photograph of Snicket and a self-portrait of the illustrator, Brett Hellquist? The photographs are intentionally blurry and shot from bad angles, so we never get to see what he actually looks like. The film solves this by only showing Snicket's silhouette as he's typing. So, as far as appearances go, we only know that he has hair and no beard. At about the halfway point of the movie, the children find a photograph of what we can assume are the members of VFD. One face is blurry, which could imply that this is Snicket. The visual storytelling here lets us know that Snicket had a bigger role in the story once. The photo is only in frame for a few seconds, and he's easy to miss, but this is a clever way of establishing his past without actually telling us. Snicket is in a clock tower as is right in the story. We find out this at the end when he hides the manuscript. This is an odd choice, given that none of the 13 books places him in such a location. One reason why could be the visual impression. It's interesting to look at. The cogs create the illusion of movement to keep the viewer distracted from the fact that Snicket is just sitting by a desk. They also create a contrast to Snicket's mess of paper and used clippings. The cogs are constantly turning, but they still imply an order. They are, after all, part of a machine. This serves to highlight that Snicket as a person is unorganized, and thus we find out something more about him. Another reason is the film language. Snicket is all the way up at the top of a tower. He is separated from the other characters, but also above them. This others him and keeps him outside, while also showing that he's got power. Snicket is the narrator after all. He is the one who controls the story. In both movie and books, he makes it clear that he is the one in charge of what we get to see and read. We can only trust his conscience to keep him from lying. Now, we briefly need to discuss zeitgeist theory. Basically, Germany in the 1800s came up with the idea that there is a sort of invisible dominance that decides how periods of time look. Baroque of France's 1700s and flapper culture of the 20s are some examples. In this context, zeitgeist means that certain aspects of a text change in adaptation to better suit a modern audience's presumed opinions and expectations. The books intentionally avoid placing the story in any given period. The illustrations seem to place the children in early 1900s, but in the third book they mention a jeep. The fifth book explicitly states that computers exist in the story. This works well when written, but not on a film. Every object shown carries connotations that places the story in a certain time. A book doesn't have to describe everything, but in a movie the audience gets to see furniture, architecture, clothing, all of which according to zeitgeist theory is connected to a certain era. Take something as usual as Aunt Josephine's fridge. In the book, she's afraid it'll topple over and crush someone. The only information we get is thus that she owns a fridge, and this places her anytime in history after 1913. In the movie, however, we get to actually see the fridge, and now it visually tells us that the story is post-1950s. So what's my point here? Well, I think Snicket being surrounded by cogs is meant to allude to steampunk. Steampunk is a mishmash of technology and time, which is a fairly apt description of the series. The cog is obviously an important symbol for steampunk, and it is one of the first things we see in the movie. This serves to give the audience an idea of what to expect, given that the viewer is familiar with the genre and what elements and aesthetics are associated with it. The cogs and their steampunk connotations could also be a metaphor for Snicket himself. He exists physically in the present, but is emotionally stuck in the past. The cogs tell the viewer both of the story's genre and the personality of its narrator. The Snicket of the book starts out as just a narrator, although one with opinions. As a trace of postmodern influences, the reader gains more and more information about him through the framing device, and this creates another level of the Baudelaire story. Someone is chasing Lemony, and he has to hide the manuscript away. Thus, we can extrapolate that the children's story is important, and someone does not want it published. So why is Snicket so interested in these kids? in later books, we find out that the Beatrice he's been dedicating the books to is in fact the children's mother. He follows the siblings for the sake of their mom. This is lost in the film adaptation. Including him too prominently in a movie just under 2 hours long would take away from the main story, that of the children. The movie compensates by giving his lines to other characters. Take for example the running joke of Sunny speaking gibberish and Snicket translating for her in the narration. The movie simply adds subtitles to Sunny's lines. Snicket translates for Sunny only once, at the very beginning.
Which probably meant, "Look at that mysterious figure emerging from the fog."
With this, a certain middle ground is struck as Snicket and Sunny sort of speaks at the same time, and this segues into the actual story. Snicket's dialogue is also heavily rewritten, which differs from the dialogue of other characters in the film. Despite the fact that Snicket probably is the one who speaks the most in the entire book series, he gets to keep only 3 lines.
If you have ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. It's like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark and thinking that there's one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air and there's a sickly moment of dark surprise. The Baudelaires were very fortunate indeed.
These lines have to be important by virtue of being kept. What they have in common is that they let Snicket show empathy. He knows what it means to grieve, and thus a viewer unaware of Beatrice still gets the impression that Snicket has lost someone important to him. The biggest change is the paraphrase line at the very end. Here, Snicket ends the story with a flourish, unlike the end of The Wide Window. The books continue after the 3rd volume, but the movie's format do not allow for further adaptations. In a Western audience, a happy ending is expected, and so Snicket must be happy at the end. He states that the world is not at all such a bad place if you're willing to fight for it. Not a bad message, but the Snicket of the books would never be able to say this. He never loses his grief, even at the very end of his story. Thanks for watching! I plan on doing more videos like this where I discuss media and transmedial relationships. Please subscribe if you feel like having one more video essayist on your list. Can never have too many of those.